So today we're going to be getting into a very long course on a beginner's guide to Ableton Live. Ableton is a very unique program and I've gotten a lot of requests for this video, so let's dive right in. Okay, before we get started with the installation and process of setting up Ableton Live, let's talk a little bit about Ableton's history. I'll tell you a funny story. The first time I heard about Ableton, I was young, working in retail, and I would always go to this music production store down the street named Professional Sound and Music, who actually helped build this studio back in the day. Funny thing was, there's a guy named Ray over there that was always working there, and he showed me Ableton Live. I think it was pretty new, brand new. I was obviously a Pro Tools user back then and still am, but the one thing about Ableton that piqued my interest, although I didn't use it at the time, was the ability to elasticize the audio, or what you could call warp audio in Ableton. Pro Tools calls it elasticize audio, and Pro Tools had to follow suit and release that feature later because they didn't have that. So Ableton was the pioneer of this feature, and we'll get into that in this video. But that, Ableton's been around a long time. It's one of the more unique DAWs on the market because it has two different ways of working, which we're going to explain in depth as well. So let's get into the installation process and setting up Ableton Live. As you can see here, I am on the Ableton website, and I am a Live 11 Suite user, and here is where you can download whichever version that you need. So if you're a Mac user or an older Mac or Windows, you need to get whatever version that you need for Ableton. Once you have that, it's just as easy as installing the program. So I already have mine installed, but I'm going to try to walk you through the process here a bit and just show you kind of what this looks like. So as you see here now, it's opening up the DMG file. Remember, I'm on a Mac, so if you're on a PC, I recommend that you just follow the prompts. You should know how to install software or use their user guide if you have any questions. All you have to do is drop this right in to install Ableton into the applications folder on the Mac, and you're done. There are different versions of Ableton. You might not be a Suite user. You might have Ableton Lite, but whatever version you have, you can always upgrade later, and you can run all of them. I believe you can run multiple versions of Ableton. They all are labeled different things. So that's how you're going to start installing Ableton on the Mac. Once again, if you need help with the PC, just refer to the Ableton user guide for installation instructions. Okay, once you open up Ableton for the first time, this is the screen you're going to see. I've obviously changed my default live set, as what they call it, because I have my own templates ready to go for things that I need, as you can see here under this template section. But I loaded up the default live set so you can see that as well. Before we get into the actual use of Ableton, let's talk about some setup. Okay, so if you hit the live button at the top left of your screen and you click on preferences, this little window is going to pop up. And let's talk about some of the settings here. Now, I have a full-blown video on Ableton Preferences, but I'm going to get into it again. But I'll leave you a link down below if you want to check that older one out. So the first thing that you're going to see is language. So if you're using Ableton and you want it to be in a different language, you can change that here. Another thing you have is the option to do not show warning signs, and you can restore that back to default if you'd like. This is going to give you follow behavior for your timeline, so you can change it to scroll or page. And the other thing that you can do is show and hide labels. And what you can see right here is down at the bottom left, I have a little window info screen showing you what this is. So the follow behavior will determine the behavior of the follow switch in Ableton Live's control bar. Follow can operate by scrolling continuously or on a page-by-page basis. That might help if you're working with a CPU that may not be as fast, or a graphics card that may not be displaying fast enough, so it might help you if you are on a slower computer. This right here says when hide is enabled, certain labels are hidden in the session view mixer to save a bit of extra space. So this can give you some more screen real estate if you have a small screen. Right here, the permanent scrub area, when on the lower portion of the beat time ruler, is a scrub area for both clips and the arrangement. When off, hold shift to scrub through the beat time ruler. This is a little bit more advanced than what we need to be talking about today, but know it's there and know that it's available to you. And if you're using a tablet, you can turn on pen tablet mode. I've never done that myself. But I want to talk about more of the important settings we need to discuss. So you can auto assign track colors, and I have mine on. it's just going to make the colors automatic. But I'm going to talk about in a future video my color coding system with Ableton as well. The default track color, if you want it to be a certain color, you can do that as well. And clip color, you can make them the track colors, or you can randomize them, whatever you prefer. And Ableton calls the clips that you'll learn about, the MIDI clips or audio clips, whether they be in the arrangement view that you're seeing behind the Preferences tab, or when we switch to session view, you have little clips and slots. That's what Ableton calls clips. Now, reduced automation colors. This is going to use a reduced color palette when assigning to clips and tracks. And if you see at the bottom left here, this palette makes clips and tracks easier to tell apart for color vision deficiency. So if you have a vision issue, you might want to turn this on. The other thing you can do is you can change the themes. So you have a light theme, a mid-light, a mid-dark, and a dark theme. And then here's the old Live 9 theme. Lately, I've been using the dark theme. I used to use the light theme, but sometimes I switch it up. And then I have a pretty large monitor here with a lot of screen real estate, so I zoom in a little bit. But you can see at 100%, there's the default right there. And so we'll leave it at that for the purpose of this video, because I've shrunk my Ableton window to fit in the YouTube requirements. Another thing you get is brightness options. So if your screen is too dull, you can turn Ableton's brightness up there. You also have color intensity. I pretty much just leave all of this at 0. Color hue, grid line intensity. I mean, I don't really play with this stuff. There's no reason for me. The grid lines, you can see the grid lines are there at 0, they disappear. And we'll talk about the grid as we get into this guide. So this is the first tab on the Ableton Preferences window, which is the look and feel. Okay, the next section in the Preferences panel is the audio tab. And we're going to talk about each of the features here. The first thing is, if you're setting up Ableton, just leave this at core audio. This is the driver type, and it's going to be able to choose the different driver types you have available on the computer. I only have no audio or core audio, so I'm going to leave that alone. The next thing is my audio input and output device. And depending on whatever audio interface you're using, you're going to want to select that in here. So if you have a universal audio interface or a PreSonus or whatever brand you have, you're going to want to select those. And then from there, what you can do is set up your inputs and outputs. So you can turn on all the available inputs and outputs you have, or you can pick and choose and just say if you want to run a certain amount of inputs and outputs that you have available to your interface. So set those up. The next thing here is the sample rate. And if you're a little unsure about what bit depths and sample rates are, I'm not going to get into it in this video. I made a video about that a long time ago. I'll leave you a link in the description so you can check that out. But what you have the ability to do here is select the sample rate that you want your session to be running in. Typical CD quality was 44,100 or 44.1 sample rate. I typically work in 48K. I can get all the way up to 192 if I want. But one of the most important things that you want to remember when dealing with sample rates is you never want to convert down, even bit depth. You want to always work in the same format, and then when you get to the mastering stage and you have a mastering engineer like me work on your music, what you want to then do is have them dither everything down to the final bit depth and sample rate that you need for your distribution. So the next thing here is default sample rate and pitch conversion, and you can leave this at normal or high quality. I use high quality, but if you have a slower computer, you might want to put this back to normal. Next, we have latency, which is the amount of buffer that you're running. As you can see, I'm running pretty low, but you want to run low when you're recording or playing, say, MIDI controllers like a keyboard, because you're going to have less latency. But as you start to get into your mix down phase, for example, and you start to add a lot of plugins, the CPU will start to overload, and you'll see that in the top right of the CPU, this little thing that's moving right here, this little bar with the 4%, 3%. That's my CPU usage, and I'll get into that later. To increase your buffer, you just drop this down and pick a higher buffer. So if you start having trouble with playback, you're going to want to increase this. And then it tells you input latency, output latency. You have driver error compensation for interfaces that might have some that need compensation. I never use this myself, so I wouldn't worry about it. And then you have the ability to run a test tone to make sure your interface is working. So you can click this and turn it on, pick the volume, the frequency. And then here, this is the CPU usage simulator. So I leave this alone. This is to help you figure out the best buffer setting for your audio interface. What I prefer to do though, I run a pretty big computer, so I don't even really touch this. And as a beginner, I wouldn't advise that you worry about that right now. Really what you want to focus on here is getting your audio right, getting your interface selected, setting up your inputs and outputs, picking your sample rate, setting up a buffer size that works well. I think Ableton defaults at 512, so it can have a little latency. Try to lower it, and if you have no issues, you should be good. So that is the audio tab in the Preferences panel. Okay, the next tab in the Preferences panel is the Link, Tempo, and MIDI tab. And here you get options to use the link features in Ableton Live, which I don't ever do. But here you can see that you can hide this little link button up here. And this button will show link-enabled devices, which I'm not personally using. So I do leave it on show. You can show start, stop, sync, and by turning this on, it's all related to the Ableton link stuff. Another thing here is the tempo follower, and if I hide that, you can see this follow button disappears. I'm not personally using this, and as a beginner, I don't recommend you use this. Unless you're using something that Ableton links with, maybe like a push or something, I believe that's what this section is for. But the other section down below is important because this is where you can select the Ableton push, and I don't actually own an Ableton push. But if you're using any type of keyboard or controller, which you probably are, and if you're not, I recommend getting one. This is where you can select the control surface, and if you have it plugged into your computer, it will usually automatically just show up right here. And so as you can see, I have on this computer right now, I have a Complete Control hooked up right here, Complete Control A, and that is how you can get your MIDI controller to work. The next section here is Takeover Mode. This will set up the controller takeover preference. As a beginner, I suggest you just leave this to none because it's going to work the best for you. And last but not least, if you have any available MIDI ports or a MIDI hardware box, like I have a Mode 2 Express, you can select different settings here and turn them on and off. So if you want to have a track switch for a MIDI input, you can turn that on and off here. You can turn on the synchronization or remote control, or MPE, which is per note expression, or MIDI note expressions. So ideally, you're probably not going to have as much as you see that I do. I do have some older hardware that requires old school MIDI. If you're using all newer MIDI that uses the USB and not the old MIDI port, then it's very easy. As you can see, the complete control here is right here. Just check this box to enable the input to track the MIDI coming into Ableton. And if you want to sync out, you can. You probably won't need to do much with by doing that with a controller, but just make sure this first box is checked. And possibly if the controller has like start, stop, transport controls, you can turn on remote control here. So if you want to be able to control Ableton and start it and stop it from your controller, that is what this remote section is for. So this is the link, tempo, and MIDI panel in the Preferences panel. Okay, the next section in the Preferences panel is the File Folder section. And this is an important section, so we're going to get into some details here. So the first thing you see is data handling, and what this is an on and off switch to create analysis files. Ableton creates analysis files when analyzing songs and placing warp markers. And this will do this to your sound library and various things you bring into Ableton. I recommend you leave this on. The next thing is, if you have a sample editor that you like to use, you can browse one here. If you have a preferred one and don't want to use the Ableton one, this will allow you to do that. If you're also working in the default set and you haven't saved anything, Ableton's going to save that into a temporary folder, and this is the location of that folder. So you can change that here by using the browse. The Max application, if you use Max for Live, which is a little bit more advanced, I'm not going to get into that in this video. This shows the path to your Max for Live installation, so you could leave that alone for now. This is your caching. So this is where Ableton stores its caching, and you can set up free space, cache size, and where the location of the cache folder is. You also have a cleanup button. I recommend you just leave this all at default. There's nothing more you need to really do here under the file folder section. Make sure the analysis is on and leave everything else the same. Next, we have the library tab, and this is an interesting one because you get a couple of important settings here. The first one I would leave is collect files on export. So if you export your project and you want Ableton to collect all the files with it, I suggest you leave this always on. You could set it to ask or never. This is if you're using Ableton packs. You could show the downloaded packs. You could turn this on or off. Just leave it on. This is Ableton Live and Note. I don't use this myself, so I leave it off, but it's enable cloud sync. If you do want to use this feature, you'd need to turn it on here. Here you have the ability, if you're using Ableton Push, which I'm not, to turn the show push option on or off, and this will show push in the live browser. As you can see, it's right here under places, right over here. If I take this off, it disappears. I'm not actually using push, so I should probably leave that off, but by default, it's on. Now here's the important part of this section, the location of your user library. I run external hard drives for all my sound libraries, and so that's why I've changed this. Yours is going to look different, but if you want to change your sound library, you can change that here. The location of your user library, the installation folder for Ableton packs, and then you can get a link to get more packs. The next tab we have is the plugins tab, and this one is important as well because if you install the new plugin, it's not showing up, you can use this rescan button here. This is where below you can turn off which plugins you're using. So if you want to use Audio Units version 2, Audio Units version 3, VST, plugin system folders, or if you have a custom VST folder. So this is going to look for the VST plugins in the default folder, or if you want to turn on a custom folder and then set that custom folder. VST3, I just leave everything on the system. I just let the plugins install to the system. So as a beginner, I would recommend you just leave all of this alone. Turn on which ones you want to use. For brief synopsis, Audio Units is for Mac. VST is a general plugin type. And the benefit to using VST is if you needed to open your Ableton session on a PC from a Mac, for example, VSTs are universal between both systems, whereas Audio Units are not. Personally, though, I do use Audio Units. I don't really ever open up my sessions in VSTs. The other thing too, I've had some issues with Waves plugins in VST, so I use VST3 for Waves, especially on this newer computer. It's one of the things I made a video on, Waves plugins issues, so if you want to check that out, I'll leave you a link. And then here you get the option to do various things with your plugins. So if you want to have multiple plugin windows open, you could turn that on or off. You can auto hide plugin windows on or off. And then you can auto open plugin windows on or off. So this is all just a preference thing on how you like to work. And as you start to work with Ableton, remember these are here. Maybe you don't like plugins popping up automatically when you turn it on, or maybe you only want to look at one at a time. So there's some options that you should check out right there. Okay, the next tab in the Ableton Preferences window is the Record, Warp, and Launch tab. And there's a very important feature in here I do want to bring up, so pay attention. First, we have the record section, and this is where you're going to be able to choose between WAV or AIFF file types. And then you have the bit depth, which I talked about earlier. You can work in 16, 24, 32. I typically work in 24-bit, but you might want to change that. I do recommend working in a high quality and then once again dithering down along with your sample rate based on your distributor recommendations or requirements. The next thing is when you have a count in, so when you hit the record button on the transport, this will select the default number of bars that Ableton will count in so you can get ready to perform. I leave mine at 2 bars. That's just how I like it. And then when you have this exclusive section will allow you to exclusively record arm a track versus letting multiple ones be armed. You can do that by holding shift and hitting the record button over here, which we'll get into that stuff later. And this is the exclusive solo button. So this allows only one track at a time to be soloed. And you can choose to turn these on or off. The clip update rate is the rate at which Live updates a running clip settings. When you change a running session, clips controls during recording, Live creates copies of the clip at the chosen clip update rate and puts them into the arrangement. So I would leave this alone. I've never even actually touched this myself. I was just reading at the bottom left what this does. The next one is record session automation in, and this is whether automation can be recorded in all playing session view clips or only that clips are playing in armed tracks. So these are all really detailed preferences for how you like to work. I would recommend leaving all of this pretty standard. Really focus on the file type and the bit depth. And then start playback with record. You can choose this to start immediately when the arrangement record button is pressed, or you can, when it's disabled, playback will not start till the play button is pressed. So you have the option there of how you like to basically have the record begin. Warps and fades. This is an important one. Loop, warp, short samples. Okay, so I leave this on auto, but you can unwarp one shot, you can warp one shot, you can pick kind of what you want to do here. Long samples, auto warp, I leave that on. You can turn that off. Default warp mode, I leave it beats. And when we talk about warp modes, we'll get into the different types. This is a very important setting that I like to turn off. By default, it's actually on. Create fades on clip edges. What this does is when you bring in files or samples, the edges, the beginning and the end, Ableton will put an automatic little fade. Now, if you work on loop-based music or bringing in loops, even one-shots, you may lose a little bit of that transient, or you may get a little weird. And now, mind you, the fade is really small, but it's noticeable. So I recommend before you start creating music as a beginner, you come in here and you turn this off. And then this is the launch mode. For all newly created clips, this is how Ableton is going to react. All of this stuff as a beginner, just leave it alone. It's not necessary for you to change any of this stuff. Default launch quantization, leave it on the global setting, which is going to be up here in the top left. Select on launch is on. You can turn this off. What this is going to do is when you hit a clip to launch, it's going to select that clip. Like I said, this is all advanced preferences for how you like to work. So as a beginner, leave it at the default settings, and then when you get more advanced, come back in and check some of this stuff out. Start recording on scene launch. This is set to off, but when this preference is set to on, launching a scene will also begin recording in any armed clip slots belonging to that scene. And then you have the tap tempo, start playback with tap tempo. This will start playback after the tap tempo button has been triggered. So just another preference that you can decide if you want on or off. And MIDI note drawing, when set to on, drawing MIDI notes is constrained to one single key track or pitch at a time, while holding the option key allows freehand melodic drawing. So this is set to off. You can learn more about that down at the bottom left. Draw MIDI notes with pitch lock. Last but not least, we have the licenses tab, which is just Ableton licensing and maintenance stuff. You can have, authorize Ableton here, automatic updates, and then you can choose to send usage data to Ableton. So this is an overview of the preferences panel. Let's continue moving forward with the Ableton guide for beginners and talk about Ableton's different view types and setting up your controllers and getting going. Okay, so we're back at the arrangement view. And before we begin talking about various views in Ableton, I want to talk about some preliminary stuff that you need to understand. First of all, it's going to be important that you have some type of MIDI controller hooked up. And if you don't own one, you can use keyboard here. And the way to do that real quick is just to use this computer keyboard button right here. And you just turn that on and off, and that will allow you to play MIDI with your computer keyboard. As you can see, as I'm hitting some of these buttons, you're seeing some MIDI coming in. So remember that. That's a good one. Another good tip here is you get some helpful tips. And I have this, it's on by default because I'm on the default live set like we spoke about earlier. But you can hide that. But if you use this little arrow here, you could turn that on and off. So as a beginner, I recommend you leave that on, because as you wheel around or scroll around to different things, you're going to get information about each item as you see here. So those are two very important tips that I recommend beginners definitely use. And if you don't have a MIDI controller, use your keyboard. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is session management. So right now I have an untitled session here, and it's very important to understand how Ableton saves sessions. Currently, Ableton is saving whatever I do in the temp folder that we talked about in the preferences panel. But let's go ahead and hit File, Save Live Set As, and I'm just going to call this, let's go ahead and call this Ableton Guide. Now, what Ableton is going to do is Ableton is going to create let's go into that hard drive, a folder here, and inside that folder is the session file and project info. And as you start to work with audio, you're going to see other folders pop up in here. Another thing that I like to do is if I bring in any outside samples, not stuff that's not on my computer, maybe from my DJ computer, or if it's an acapella or a full song, I'll create an assets folder. Another thing I like to do is I like to create a bounces folder for when I do my exports. So when I do my first export, I'll usually create that folder. And just be aware that when you save a new session, you need to back out of this folder. Otherwise, you're going to start stacking in Ableton sessions within one Ableton project folder. And the real way to do that is to have multiple project folders. As you can see right here, this is a newer hard drive, but I've got some sessions here. And I like to label my project folders with the artist name and the project, the key, and the BPM. Because as you can see, when you get, this is my older hard drive, when you get to be years in and you have a lot of projects going on, it can get overwhelming. So make sure that you have a good naming convention and you follow it, because it's going to save you in the end. So that is a little bit about session management. It's very important that you understand that. I've seen some people kind of saving sessions within one folder, and that can be extremely messy, and you will run into some problems if that folder ever got corrupted. You could lose all your stuff. So another thing about session management is make sure you're backing up your files. I have a video on backing up your files, and what I use is Carbon Copy Cloner. So I'll leave you a link in the description. Make sure you go back and check that out. Okay, another thing that's worth noting is as you start to work in a project, Ableton will create a backup folder. So here's a project that I was recently working on this week, and Ableton will create this backup folder, and it will automatically start doing automatic backups. And if you ever have a problem with your main session, this is a great way to restore some of your previous work. So always do remember that Ableton is doing that in the background, and that this backup folder, don't ever get rid of it. That will appear in your project folder, and it's a per project thing. So if you don't make new projects in their own respective folders, those backups are going to get all convoluted into one if you just leave all these Ableton sessions in one main project folder. So always remember to back up from saving your session in a folder and save it in a sessions folder. And then another thing that I like to do is I like to move my sessions through stages. So I kind of have like, ideas, production. Oh, now the production's finished. Maybe I want to steal sounds and save things, and then I archive them. So I kind of have a system that I use because I'm working on a lot of music all the time. So I need to stay organized. I need to know who they're for and all of that great stuff. So I hope that helps you understand Ableton sessions. Let's get back into the Ableton guide. Okay, now we're going to get into the actual program itself. And when you open up Ableton, you're going to be landing on this screen right here. And this screen is called the arrangement view. And Ableton is very unique, like I mentioned earlier, because it has two views. You have the arrangement view, and then if you hit tab and you tab over, you have not only your mixer view, but you have what they call session view. Now, I like to increase my mixer size to the max. That might be something you may or may not want to do when you're first setting up your Ableton. And then when I get my templates the way I like to save them as a template. And you could do that by using the File menu and Save Live Set as Template. And I'm sorry you can't see that on my screen, but just go up to the top left and hit File on your Ableton. You have a few options up there to save live set as template or to save live as the default set. If you save it as a template, it's going to drop the template into this templates folder. And then you'll see that there's one here called default. That's the default live set that will open up every time Ableton opens up. So I'm using the stock Ableton default set right here. So my screen matches yours as a beginner, But over time, you'll start to develop your own templates, and then you can have them automatically load up or load them here in your templates folder. So let's briefly chat real quick about the concepts behind each view before we get into actually using the program. This arrangement view that you see here is your typical timeline view where the audio moves from left to right. And this is the practical view that people are used to seeing in most all DAWs. You know, I think with the exception of Fruity Loops has the little sequencer view that I've seen. I'm not a Fruity Loops user, but Ableton is unique in that way where it kind of has the two views. Now, all DAWs have the arrangement view, but they all have a mixer view. But what's different is this clips section. So I'm going to flip back to arrangement view and just talk a little bit about arrangement view. You get all the same features of a timeline-based DAW. You have tracks right here to the right, MIDI tracks, audio tracks. There's four that are started when you turn on Ableton for the first time. It gives you 2 audio tracks, 2 MIDI tracks, and then you have your return tracks and your master. So that's a brief overview of the different track options you have. You know, Ableton is unique in that way where it kind of has the two views. Now, all DAWs have the arrangement view, but they all have a mixer view. But what's different is this clips section. So I'm going to flip back to arrangement view and just talk a little bit about arrangement view. You get all the same features of a timeline-based DAW. You have tracks right here to the right, MIDI tracks, audio tracks. There's four that are started when you turn on Ableton for the first time. It gives you 2 audio tracks, 2 MIDI tracks, and then you have your return tracks and your master. So that's a brief overview of the different track options you have. What you can do, let's start at the top left and go at the top bar and work our way around the screen. So at the top bar, you have a bunch of features here, like the link follow that we talked about, an external sync switch. So if you want to use an external sync clock, you have the tap tempo button, your BPM here. So if you want to change your tempo of the song, here you have phase, nudge, up, down. And this is to synchronize to external music if you're using Ableton, say, to DJ live. You also have your time signature, so if you want to get out a 4/4 time, and then here you have your metronome, and if you click the little arrow, you get your metronome options, so you can change your count in right here, the sound of the metronome, and the rhythm of the metronome, enable only while recording, and then you have your on-off button here. And then here what you have is your quantization menu. So this is going to choose the global launch quantization that it's going to automatically try to quantize to whatever setting this is. So if you want to shorten this up and you want to quantize smaller, you can change that here. And as you can see at the bottom left, which is really handy, like I said, click to choose the global launch quantization. Quantization is used to avoid rhythmical error when playing clips. So if you are unfamiliar with what quantization is, we'll get into that a little bit later. But if you're recording MIDI clips and your notes are off, you can quantize it to a grid. It's going to give it a more robotic feel unless you use a swing feature. We're going to talk about all of that later, but this is where the global launch quantization feature can be found. Next, you have your transport controls, and here you have the follow button. So this is going to follow the timeline when you're playing. This is your arrangement position. Notice this changes as I click around the arrangement. And then you have your play, stop, record, enable. This is MIDI arrangement overdub. So this will allow you to overdub MIDI notes on top of existing MIDI. Here you have your automation arm. So if you get into automation, which we're going to talk about later, you can arm that here. Manual parameter changes can be made when turning this on. Let's verify exactly what it says. When enabled, manual parameter changes can be recorded to session clips and the arrangement. So the record session automation preference determines whether automation will be recorded in all playing clips or only in armed tracks. So there you go. I don't really use that much. I do a lot of my automation by drawing it in. But if you ever see this little icon right here, this turning red, that means you've adjusted something and the automation is not running. So if you want to turn your automation back on, you need to come up here and re-enable it. This is a handy little feature called Capture MIDI. And a friend of mine showed this to me. It just appeared in my Ableton 11. I don't think they had this in 10, or I was not using it. But if you are playing stuff and you weren't recording and you just had that magic moment, which happens quite often, you can come up here and just hit this button and it will bring in whatever MIDI you recorded. So it's kind of always monitoring your active MIDI channels at that time, whatever you have record enabled or whatever's active. So it's a great feature. This is the session record button. This toggles between playback and overdub recording for clips which are currently playing on armed tracks. So you can learn a little bit more about that here. I don't typically need to use this myself. Here you have your loop options. So this is your loop length. If I wanted to change this to say 4 bars, or this is where it's beginning, you see how the loop marker position is starting. And here's the loop brace. So if I was to turn this on, now this loop brace is active. I could extend this and you can see the duration of the loop is here. So if I wanted it to be 8 bars, I can do that. And this is your punch in switch. This is your punch out switch, and then your loop region length. So moving along the top bar, here we have the draw mode switch. This you can turn on by hitting the letter B. And what this allows you to do is draw in automation parameters or various things in envelopes, in MIDI clips, or whatever you're doing. We spoke about this. This is to turn your computer keyboard on and off as a MIDI controller. This is the key map mode switch. So this will map keys to certain parameters that you want. This is a little bit more of an advanced usage of Ableton. And then you have the same thing here, MIDI map mode. So this will map your MIDI controller to parameters in Ableton. If you turn one of these on and you select whatever you want and then move the controller or hit a controller button, now that button or knob will be mapped to whatever you selected, and you can control that function from your controller. Here you have your CPU load meter. So if you start seeing this get high, you need to increase that buffer in the preferences panel that we spoke about. And last but not least, you have your overload indicator, which is going to tell you that your CPU is overloading. So that's a brief overview of the top panel. Let's talk about the left. So on the left, you have your browser. You have a search bar. You have your collection section, which is very handy. I've customized mine, as you can see. If you're just starting with Ableton, you probably only have one collection, but you can add more. You have different categories here for all of the various things that Ableton offers, from browsing your sounds to browsing drums, looking at Ableton's stock instruments and effects, the stock MIDI effects, Ableton's Max for Live application, your own custom VSTs and AU plugins. See all of your installed live clips if you have any extra clips that you've installed, all of your samples, your grooves, and your templates. So the browser is where you're going to be getting around from your samples to various things that you might need, whether they be plugins or tools. And then you have a places section where you can add folders and customize your places list. So make sure you use these features because they can be very good. You can also extend this one way or the other. Then down here you have your status bar, which gives you information that you can, like we said, wheel over and learn about. Right here is your preview tab. I'm sorry I rolled over this, and what this allows you to do is preview your samples. So if you don't want to listen to them, you can turn this little headphone on and off. And then in the main window, you have your arrangement view and your tracks and all of your I/O inputs and outputs for your tracks, your mute button, your solo button, your record arm. And you can actually turn things on and off here with these little options. So here you can see this is my I/O, it's my return tracks, and then this is the mixer. And then right here you have track delay, which I like to use a lot. By default it's off, so you got to come in here and turn it on. And what this will do is it will delay your track by milliseconds or samples, whatever you choose. And then down below you can drop your instruments or samples here. This is a dual purpose view. You can double click on your clips and view them and edit them here, or you can double click on the track and edit your effects or whatever it might be that are on the tracks themselves. So you can open up your clips or your track plugins and whatever is associated with that track, and it will pop up down here. Last but not least, you have a status bar down here, as well as a clip view selector and a device view selector. And you can turn this on and off as well. So Ableton is pretty unique in that way. We also have a couple buttons here that are kind of hidden from view. But this is a height button, so it will pull things up to full height. And then this is a width button. And then here is another way, as I said, you could tab between the two views. Here's another way to get to arrangement versus clip or session view. So briefly talking about session view, what this is this is also your mixer, which you might be familiar with DAWs. You have your mixer here, your faders, your sends, your pan positions. One of the things I like to do is I like to use split stereo mode. This is a top tool tip here for you Ableton users. Ableton typically comes with a pan knob that's like a single knob, but I like to use the traditional stereo left and right. And you can save these as default audio tracks if you just right click and save as the default audio track. And that's another thing to note. We'll get into that late in a second here. But you have, moving from the bottom to top, record arm, solo button, mute, pan. You have the track volume and the peak level, your sends, which go to your return tracks. So if you're familiar with audio mixers, you understand what this stuff means. We'll get into it a little bit later. You have your MIDI I/O and your audio I/O for your audio tracks, and then you have clips. So if I want to insert a clip, say on the MIDI one, I could just double click and now I've inserted a MIDI clip. And you can see that this changed. Now I have a MIDI timeline editor and I can add notes and do what I want. And I have all these cool features here related to that clip. And there's a lot of stuff in here. It's very detailed, from everything from clip start and end position to turning loop on and off, the loop position, the loop length, the time signature of the clip, the groove, and we'll get into the groove pool a little bit later. You have options for launching this clip, which is a little bit more for advanced users. I'm not going to get into that in the beginner guide. I'm not usually using clips on this view to launch, but if you're using Ableton to play live, this is something you're going to want to check out. Then you can also change the notes, and you have envelopes here where you can adjust MIDI controls. As you see, we're on pitch bend, but look at all these different MIDI controls you have, and you can automate these parameters. Once again, you can hit B and go into draw mode. Notice the pencil changed, and I could literally draw things in if I want, or I could just work in the normal mode. And what that's going to do is it's going to adjust the pitch bend. Although I don't have an instrument on this track, so I'm just drawing in the clip. There's no sound that would come out of this even if I hit play, because there's no instrument for that MIDI to play. So there's a lot of cool features in here, and then you can loop or work with note expressions. Lots going on. For the basics, just focus on the fact of how these clips work. So if I double click, you notice how the clip comes up, or if I double click on the track, that disappears, and now I'm on the track instrument and effects browser of this MIDI track. Now for audio, if I wanted to record audio, I'd have to record enable the track, and now you see the record arm button appears instead of the stop button. And you see my vocals are coming in because I have audio coming in from this microphone right here. Before we get into recording audio, let's talk about the concept of this view though. Notice you have on the right here, you have these lanes, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4. You can actually name these lanes, and I could call this, say, intro, and then I could call this, beat. Maybe this is like a breakdown or a chorus. And I don't know why I do a lot of capitalized letters. Maybe this is my bridge. And what happens is you can play these lanes. And so they will work with this quantization setting that we talked about earlier. When you hit this, it'll play the intro. And when you get closer to ending of the intro, you want to hit play on the next one. So what this allows you to do is have different clips in these slots, and then basically kind of create ideas and structures for your song. You can turn things on and off, or mute them, or solo them, or just delete them, or hit 0 and turn them off. And so for example, if I have a clip here and I have a clip here and I hit play, boom, but I maybe only have this clip for this first lane. So this is my intro, and like I said, I don't have anything playing yet, but then I go to my beat. Notice it's not going to change until that bar crosses over. That's what that feature is for. And so this is a very broad overview of Ableton's clip view, or better known as session view. I have a full-blown video I made many years ago on the arrangement as well as session view. You can get some more details about this view there. And what you can then do is, if you lay out your song structure on this side, if you like to work this way, you can record this and play it live with these play buttons, and it will track over to the arrangement view. So you could literally run a recording of you playing the clips and the preset lanes that you've created. And that is a very powerful tool. I've seen some producers use this where they use this as a sketch pad to generate their ideas. They might have some clips that they play around with, but then they just sequence on this side. And I've seen other producers do full-blown songs in here and then transfer it over. Notice by playing these clip lanes, now these all appeared, and it's now playing this lane, not what's happening on this side if I had stuff on the side. So you can play back and forth between the two. And then to get back to the arrangement timeline, you just need to hit that button. And that will go back to playing off the arrangement view from the clip view. So you can actually be working on this side first or second, and then, oh, I want to go fool around with some clips, change things around, make up some new ones, test them out. Oh, you know what? I like that. And then bring them back over to the arrangement. And it's just a great way to have like a live sketch pad. It's very unique how Ableton also put the clip view above the mixer. So you also need to come over here if you want to just look at a mixer view. If you don't like to use clips, you don't have to. It's really an optional thing. I myself these days mainly just sequence and arrange in the arrangement view, but you never know. There might be a time when I want to go back to clip view, and I used to use it back in the day. So that's an overview of the different types of views in Ableton. Let's get into the next stuff. Okay. Next, I want to talk about the difference between audio tracks and MIDI tracks. So audio tracks is when you want to record raw audio, like my voice. If I record and enable this track, you're going to see my voice is coming in. And as you can see from those channel inputs that I showed you in the preferences panel, all of them will show up here. I have my stereo pairs or I have my mono channels. Since this is a microphone and we're going to use my voice to record, I'm going to select number 1. I don't want the microphone to be in stereo. As you see, it's only coming in on the left. So we're going to pick number 1. And audio tracks are what they are, audio. So if you have, say, a piano and you mic'd it up, or a guitar and you're running it directly into your interface through the high Z input, you're going to be using an audio track. So if you're a beginner at this game, you may or may not know what MIDI is. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and it's a communication protocol for musical instruments to talk to each other. So the difference between audio and MIDI is MIDI doesn't actually have audio. If I record MIDI, say playing it from a keyboard, or if I turn on the computer keyboard here, and I'm just using this as an example, when I record this MIDI, what it's doing is it's recording things like how hard I press the note, how long I press the note, what note I actually hit, and it will record all of that. What you need to know about MIDI is it will just record the data. So you have to route the MIDI to a soft synth, or it needs to be routed back to external hardware of some sort, whatever that is, but you can actually record the performance and have the audio on another track. So I hope that helps you understand the differences between audio versus MIDI, because those are the different track types that you have available to you. And then another track type that you have available to you is a return track. And if you were to create return tracks, which if you go to create at the top, you have the option to create audio tracks, MIDI tracks, and return tracks. And what the return tracks allow you to do is send signal from your tracks to them and then have effects or other parameters on these sends and returns. A lot of beginners like to put effects directly on these tracks, and that's okay if you like to do that. But there's a benefit to using send and returns. And I have a full video on auxiliary sends and returns that I've made, and you can check that out. I'll leave you a link down below, but I'll briefly explain right here is you can automate the send level. So here you see the send levels, and when we get into automation, you'll understand what this means, which we're going to discuss later in this video. But if I just want to send, say, one word or a phrase to a delay unit, I can't do that by putting the delay on the track itself. I have to put the delay on the send. See, here's a delay that comes in stock with Ableton. So if I just wanted to send the last word of the sentence to the delay, I'd have to automate that with a send. So another top tip for you there if you're not familiar with sends and returns. Okay, as you start to develop a lot of tracks in your session, you're going to want to start trying to organize and color code. So one of the things you can do is what I just did right there was I just held Option or Alt and just hit the arrow, so it closed all of these into a collapsed view. And I can change the names of these by hitting Command R or just right-clicking and renaming. And as you can see, if I right-click on these tracks, I get quite a lot of options from cut, copy, duplicate, delete, rename, edit, info text. I could freeze the track, which freezing tracks will basically bounce it to audio and store it in a state so it will save you on some CPU if you're running out. It's a good way to archive, and it will store the audio instead of the plugin parameters, potentially for people if they don't have the plugins. You can freeze the tracks, and then after you freeze, you can actually just flatten to audio, and it will eliminate all the plugins, and it'll just convert everything to audio. So it's a great way to archive your sessions as well. You have the options to insert audio tracks, MIDI tracks, return tracks. You can group the tracks, which we'll talk about in a second, and you can insert a take lane or show take lanes. This is a bit more of an advanced feature. Take lanes are for if you want to record multiple takes of the same thing and you want to open them all up into lanes. We can do that here in a second and give you an example of what it is about, but I have a full-blown video on that I've made in the past, so I'll leave you a link to that down below. Right now we're talking about organizing, so here you have color coding options. And then you can assign the track color to clips. So we don't have any clips yet. So let's go ahead and make a clip. I'm just going to select this area right here on the MIDI clip and insert MIDI clip. Notice how it made it the same color of the track. And maybe this was a piano. So I'm just going to name that piano. And I like to name all my tracks and keep everything nice and organized. And I like to color code. And once I've color coded that track, the clip did not change with it. I could right click and I could assign the track color to clip. I could do that for all my tracks if I have a bunch of colors already made on my tracks and I want the clips to follow that. So color coding is a great way to keep your session organized. You can also do things to help keep yourself organized by adding a locator. Notice if I clicked at the top, I can insert a time signature change or insert a locator or delete that locator. So I could maybe this is a breakdown and I put breakdown, and then this is the drop and I put drop. And so what you are now doing is you're just creating a more organized workflow, which is going to help speed you up, make you efficient. And I plan to do a full video on color coding and how I do my color coding here. So stay tuned for that. It's coming out soon. And I definitely recommend, I see a lot of beginners just leaving the track names audio 1, audio 2, MIDI 1. If you start to work as a professional in this field, that is not going to fly. And I myself as an engineer, sometimes I'll get audio files and they're not labeled. It ends up taking me time to have to sort through the mess and figure out what's what. So always send your stems labeled if you're sending them to professional mastering or just mix engineers in general. We would really appreciate it if you do that. And a top tip, if you do keep your session organized, it's just going to speed you up. So it's a good habit to get into. You should set up an organization system right when you begin producing music. Okay, now we're going to get into the fun part. We're going to start doing some recording. So I'm going to select all these MIDI clips by holding shift and just clicking on them and delete them. And first we're going to start with audio. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on this first audio track. And I'm going to name it like I just told you and use my color coding system. And this way, if I do it before I record, the clip will actually be color coded. So there's another little tip for you. Let's go ahead and record myself. Now, a couple things to note here. Yes, I want it externally in. Here you could do resampling, which is a very cool trick, or you can have routing options so you can pick where you want this audio to come from. But I'm going to use my voice. And I already got number 1 selected, and here you have your monitoring options. So right now, because I don't want to listen to my voice being recorded, I can hear myself talk, I'm going to leave this to off. But if you needed to turn this to in, if you want to monitor what's coming in, you could do that, or you could leave it on auto. So let's go ahead and hit record here. And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Mastering. YouTube channel, and we're going to be recording my audio, recording my voice, and playing with some of the warping capabilities in Ableton. Let's begin. All right, so there's my audio, and if I play that back, and this is a test. Let me turn this up. And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live. So as you can see now, it is now down here. For the purpose of this video, what we want to talk about is some of these controls and how we can do things. So here you can see that we are zooming in just by using this little icon here. I can also take a look and see that there's a bunch of noise here. And if I select that, I can see that noise. I could hit Apple E and slice that out. I could delete that. I don't even need to slice it. I could just delete it. If you notice this little square here, I can add a nice little fade. And so you can kind of clean up your audio, and I recommend you do that for vocals. So let's now take a look at what's going on with the warping feature. So as you can see, I don't have anything to warp this to, but that doesn't mean I can not tell you about it. So this is information about the clip from start and end position to the loop length if I turn the loop on and on, the groove, which we'll discuss in a little bit. Then it's automatically being warped to the beats mode. I can turn warp off. And what warping is trying to do is it's trying to put it into a fixed time. That's one of the most unique things about Ableton is it works in a global grid. Whereas other DAWs treat this view like a tape recorder. Now, to make Ableton like a tape recorder and just leave the audio stock, you need to turn the warp off. But if I then rewarp it and I bring in the BPM and say, oh, I want to work at 85 BPM, notice how it shifted all of that. So that's what the warp is trying to do. It's trying to warp it into your session's BPM. Now, I wasn't speaking, I didn't record myself speaking to a metronome, so I'm not really, on any type of BPM. But you get a lot of options here for beats, the different types of warp modes, beats, tones, texture, repitch, complex, pro. And we're not going to get into all the specifics, but general overview, if you're doing something with drums, percussion, you're going to stick with beats. Tones is going to be monophonic sounds like my voice, so I'll switch to tones. Maybe a guitar signal, keyboard, anything that has like a musical tone. Texture is good for effects and various things that are more texture based. Repitch is a little bit more complicated. You can use it to actually repitch things. And complex is Ableton's original complex warp algorithm for, say, full songs or complicated material. And Complex Pro is a newer one that also includes formants and envelopes. And so then you get the BPM settings, and you can choose to write this to RAM. It'll load the clip into RAM, or you could choose high quality rate conversion here. So if you want to save some CPU. Then you also have the gain and pitch. So if I wanted to pitch my voice down.
And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide
or up. And this is a test. I can change the volume, which you could do that here too. But really, this is me editing the clip. Now I could draw in warp markers and put these on time. If I wanted to try to warp myself to the grid better, I could do that. And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide. And so that's what the warping, or what Pro Tools calls elastic audio, really is doing. And if I wanted to, I could say, you know what? I come in here, right click here, and set 1-1 here. You might not be able to see that, I'm sorry, because it's going underneath the screen recorder, but there's a lot of options here if you right click on these warp markers. From deleting the warp marker to zooming out, quantize, slicing to a new MIDI track. You can convert the harmony or melody to a new MIDI track as audio, so you can try to take the audio and convert it to MIDI. You can do a lot of stuff. You can warp from here, start. So I just set 1-1 here. And then I want to warp from here, and it's going to set up warp markers and try to warp me into the 125 BPM that were set. And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner. So if I turn on the metronome, and this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Mastering. And it sounds like I'm talking on time now. Tried to warp me into time. And this is a test. I am recording the... Maybe that I am's a little off. Let's try to take that up. And this is a test. I am... And then and this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Mastering. So as you can see, that's what you could do with the warping capabilities. If maybe you played a note a little off, or you sang something a little off, you could come in here and warp that and fix it. And that is one of the most powerful features of Ableton Live. This is why Ableton became so popular, because it's literally trying to warp everything into time, which makes it very easy to bring in loops, bring in acapellas, and bring in little samples and work quickly, fast. So recording audio in Ableton. Now let's talk about, we talked about warping audio, let's talking about converting audio to MIDI, and then we're gonna get into MIDI next. Let's just go ahead and take this clip and I'm going to right click and I'm going to say convert melody to new MIDI track. So now what it's going to do, this isn't going to be a good example because my voice is not really an instrument. But as you can see, according to Ableton, it thinks that my voice is hitting these specific notes. And so this is a cool little thing, because let's go ahead and take an instrument and maybe we just do something like a piano, right? Electric piano muted pure. And this is a test. I am... Let's turn this metronome off. And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live. So as you can see, it tried to take my voice and turn it into MIDI. And remember what I said about MIDI. What notes were pressed, how hard it was hit. That's the velocity down here. And so I'm going to talk about recording MIDI because I just converted MIDI there. So you might play around with that. If you've got this nice loop that you like, but you want to layer it, you might try to convert it to MIDI. It's not always perfect, or it could get you in the ballpark. If you're not skilled enough to just replay it yourself, you might try that feature. You could also convert the harmony or drums to a new MIDI track. So play around with those as a beginner. It's very cool. Also, you have the option to reverse clip, or you could just hit the R button if you want to just reverse the whole clip. And there I've reversed my voice, and I'll just Command Z to undo that. So because I hit the track mute, I had to do that twice. Now let's talk about MIDI tracks. So we're going to go up here to this MIDI track, and we'll use this piano one. I don't have a, let's put on this organ vibrato, and just because I want this to be beginner, I want to use all Ableton plugins and instruments, and I want to use, I have a keyboard down here, but I'll go ahead and use the Ableton or my computer keyboard just to make it simple. So as you can see, if I now record, and this is a test, I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide. So there's my MIDI, I just hit some notes. Notice I messed up right there. I hit 2 notes in one, and I kind of did that on purpose, but I was just randomly hitting some notes here. And I can adjust this MIDI, I can select it all and Command U, quantize it. Quantize, you see how it just moved those notes, and it tries to put them on time. And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live. I could undo that. I could turn this off with 0. And this is a test. I am recording the... I know that was a mistake. Maybe I just delete it. If I want to adjust my quantize settings, I can go up here to edit and pick quantize settings. Maybe I don't want it to be on a 16th. Maybe I want it to be on an 8th. Apply. And now it quantized everything to the 8th note, but maybe this note's off. And this is a test. I want that to start here. And this is a test. And then we'll drop this down. And this is my velocity, how hard I'm hitting the note. And this is a test. I am recording the... And you can do a lot of cool stuff. If I wanted to edit the envelope, I could change the pitch bend. If I wanted to pitch this, say, up. And this is a test. And this is a test. And there's a lot of features here with MIDI that you can play with and automate within these MIDI clips. So that is the beautiful thing about working in Ableton, is you have the ability to do so much so quickly. Now, I want to go back real quick and discuss what these clips were doing. So let's just take this out, and I could literally paste that clip here. This is really an organ, but I called it piano. Or if I want to make a new one, I could just record over here. And this is a test. I am recording the... So I'm just hitting random notes. And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide. Nothing spectacular. I'm not here to make music today. I'm here to show you how to use Ableton. So I can play between these two. And that's the whole purpose of the clip view. And if I like what I did, I can then hit record and then play that. And you see it's going to erase these vocals and then record as I'm playing these clips. And so that's why this idea is a really good sketch. And then I could go back to the arrangement view, and I almost lost my vocals there. Whoops, we'll cancel that. We'll pull this out, and we'll pull this out. So that can be destructive. Just be careful.
And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Mastering
because I didn't
YouTube
hit play
channel.
fast enough.
And we're
and I could turn that on and off and deactivate that
from
clip
Distinct
if it's
Mastering
not necessary.
YouTube channel.
Maybe I want to
and
turn
we're
this
going to
section
be recording
off,
my audio, recording
or
my
just
voice,
delete
and
it.
playing.
So that's how you can record audio in MIDI and play around with the different parameters just by double clicking on these clips. You get a lot of parameters here from reverse, invert, legato, duplicate, randomize. You know, you have the envelopes, you have note expressions. There's a lot going on, and each one is different. The audio will have different settings than the MIDI settings. So I advise you to get into Ableton, record some stuff, play around, get good at some of these features. But this is a basic overview of how you're going to record audio in MIDI. So let's keep moving into the beginner's guide for Ableton Live. All right, now that we've recorded some audio in MIDI, let's draw in some MIDI. So, you know, I have this empty MIDI clip here, but I can actually go here and change this to the notes right here in this tab. And if I wanted to just draw in my own MIDI, I can do so. I can change the length. I can hit the notes. I could hit the pencil and just draw it in like this if you'd like. So lots of different things you can do here. Those are all selected, so I could play with the velocity.
From Distinct Mastering.
Maybe I don't like
from
that.
Distinct Mastering YouTube channel.
And that is a way that you can actually just draw in your own MIDI. So if you get really good, it's very fast. If you just want to draw in bass lines or draw in quick notes or say even just drums, kicks, claps, whatever, it's a great way to do it. But the reason I wanted to show you this too is because I want to show you a cool feature called scale. And what this is, especially for you beginners that may not play piano like some of us, and you're not familiar with musical scales, this can really help you out. So if I turn scale on, and I'll just stay in the C major scale, but you could pick any scale here in minor or any of the different types of scales. You have Dorian, Phrygian, you know, there's cool little scales there. But what it does is it highlights what colors the notes are in scale. So as you can see, because this G sharp was hit, that's not in the C major scale. And if I go to C minor, now you see that this A is out of the scale. So if I want to bring these into the scale, I have to select these and put them into the green. Another cool thing
from Distinct Mastering YouTube channel.
And this is per clip. So as you see, if I turn this on or double click this clip, this will now be disappeared. But because I set this up, every time I record moving forward, everything will have a scale of C minor. Another cool thing you could do is fold the scale. So you could see that if I hit this scale button, it shows me the scale. Boom, all the notes that are in the scale. And I get, that's every note. Or if I just want to fold, it'll just fold down to whatever notes I've hit. And then from there, you can just be looking at the notes that are currently being played, which makes it very handy. So for you beginners, this scale feature is absolutely huge because it can really help you keep your music in key and understand what the scales are without actually having any music theory behind you. As you get more advanced, or if you already are a musician of some sort and play an instrument, then this might not be necessary for you. But it is a very cool trick, and I advise you check it out. Okay, briefly, I want to talk about MIDI Legato Mode. So as you can see, if I double click on this clip, I have a bunch of notes that are separated from each other. If I go to the notes section of this clip and I hit legato, it's going to bring them all together. So that's a cool way to fix notes. And if you want them, maybe if you have glide turned on the instrument, you can get kind of that bending sound where it glides from one note to the other. And so there's a lot of cool things. You can invert the notes here. You can reverse them, duplicate them, randomize them, and see that's randomizing the velocities, as you can see, and you can change the range of the randomization. So there's some great tools that you can use with MIDI.
Recording my audio, recording my voice, and playing with some of the warping capabilities in Ableton.
And so, yes, this is a mess. I didn't make music, but we're going to get into making something here in a bit. So I'm not happy with this performance at all. You know what? We're going to start over, so I'm just going to delete this. But I'll leave these vocals. Let's leave those vocals. We'll use those for something. So let's continue with the Ableton guide. Okay, let's briefly talk about our grid lines here. Before we get into actually making a track quickly in Ableton with stock plugins, I want to talk about the grid. And what you see right here is you can right click on the grid and you can change the grid to widest, wide, medium, narrow, narrowest. This is an adaptive grid, but another thing you can do is do a fixed grid. So there's a 4-bar grid, here's a 16th, or you can use command and these numbers here. And as you can see, if I adjust the grid, number 4 turns it on and off. If I right click and go adaptive grid, now I can use these numbers to change the grid type. 1 makes it smaller, 2 makes it larger. And you can see this little number here that's showing me my grid view. So this is 4 to 1, now 2 to 1, 1 to 1, a half, a quarter, an eighth. I could also hit command 3 to turn it into a triplet grid, and then number 4 to turn it on and off. And so it's a great way to adjust the grid size and get in there and work. If I don't want the grid, remember command 4, and now I have no grid. But this will snap to the grid. And so using the Ableton grid can be very handy. It can make you fast. Being able to quickly move between different settings like this is a great way to move around Ableton. But notice as I zoom in and out, the grid is staying the same. And if I change it, it just looks like it's getting smaller because my zoom width. So that's a brief overview on the Ableton grid and the different grid types that you could be using and how you could switch between them. Okay, now that you've gotten an overview on the basics of Ableton, I obviously deleted what we recorded before. Now we're going to actually try to make something decent. And I'm going to use all stock Ableton stuff. So let's start off by looking at our instruments, and we'll load up a drum rack with, let's see, we've got a drum synth. I don't use a lot of the Ableton stuff too much, but let's go ahead and load up a kick and a clap. So command shift T for new MIDI track. And I don't even know what these sound like, but I'm just going to go ahead and insert a MIDI clip here. And as I told you before, we can go ahead and draw in some of our notes. And we'll just go ahead and select that and duplicate, command D. And what I can do is just duplicate this across.
And this is a test.
We're going to lower the volume of this and mute it. And so now we've got that. We'll insert a MIDI clip here. And we're going to put a clap on 2 and 4. And so you see we're clipping. So we want to turn the volume down of these 2 tracks. And like I said, I like to organize and I like to color code. So boom, there is, I'll right click, there's our 2. Now let's stay organized here. We have our piano and we have some vocals and we have this other piano. So one of these was the organ. So this was the organ. So let's rename that. And this is the piano. And these are just stock Ableton sounds of nothing special. Let's see what we've got so far. Double click just to go back to the start. Oh, my vocals aren't on.
And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Mastering, YouTube channel.
All right, so now maybe what I want to do is I want to look at analog. Let's go with, I don't know. Let's take this sweet lead here.
And this is a...
And let's just try.
And this is a test. And this is a test. And this is a test.
And I can adjust this. So look, I can take the filter cutoff down, maybe take the filter decay down.
And this is a test. And this is a test. And this is a test. And this is a test.
And then I'll just slice that and duplicate this across.
Begin.
Oh wait, but I don't have my loop on. So I can hit Command L and then my loop just automatically sets and turns on for this length I selected.
And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live.
So now I've got this nice kick and clap loop running with this one little synth hit. Let's just call this lead strike or something like that and color code it green. And boom, now we've got that. Maybe I want some chords playing in the background. I'll insert another MIDI clip here and I'll just do a basic C. Let's do a C. It's not the best piano, but for the purpose of what we're doing, I'm just here to show you how you can do cool things. So let's take these off. Let's move this one over here. And then maybe I don't want the rest of this. I could just take this loop brace and go and start an endpoint and back. So now you notice how that clip just changed. So instead of having all this, now it's just this, and it looped it automatically because I have the loop on. If I turn the loop off, it's going to shorten that up. And so if I turn it back on, I just need to drag it out, and I can drag this out infinity and it'll just keep looping. So that's another cool thing about Ableton. Horrible piano sound. But guess what? It's MIDI. So I could literally delete that and the MIDI stays in place. Let's try another instrument. Let's try this one. That's better. Very basic, but you get the point.
And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Mastering.
Okay, well, let's play around with some effects. So we've got MIDI effects, we've got audio effects, and I'm not going to get into everything here, but I'm going to take that and I'm going to run this piano through a delay. And so I'm going to just drop this delay on it. Actually, I'm going to use an echo. Very similar.
And this is a test. I am recording.
Turn the dry wet down.
And this is a test. I am recording.
I'll give it a little more space.
Guide from Distinct Mastering.
It has a little more depth to it. And there's a lot of different things. You know, I like overdrive. I can
and this is a test. I am
give it a little grit.
And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Mastering.
Maybe I want to take the lead strike and add this reverb on this return track. So all I need to do is turn up this.
And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Mastering.
And you can see that the reverb is now coming in.
My audio, recording my voice, and playing with some of the warping capabilities in Ableton. Let's begin. And this is a test. I am recording the...
And so that's an overview on how you can insert audio effects, MIDI effects. You literally can just drag these into places. And there's a ton. I don't have enough time to go over all of the different audio effects. But you have categories like delay and loop, drive and color, your dynamics like compressors and gates, limiters, EQs and filters, modulators, pitch and modulation tools, reverbs and resonance, and then you have utilities. Utility is a very handy one. I have a whole video on the Ableton utility. I'll leave you a link to that down below. Spectrum is also great. It'll give you a spectrum analyzer. What a lot of people like to do is just put this on their master and it'll give you an overview of the spectrum and analyzation of your track. So this is a good one to have. The arrow is nice and handy because you can see a bigger view of it, and as you move around you can see what frequency you're at, and you can see my voice is actually coming through. And as I get, you know, as I'm talking, if I turn this on and I switch this over to in, you'll see my voice is now coming into the spectrum because it's coming into the channel. And you're hearing it through my monitoring because I've selected it on the in. So just to touch back on, that's kind of how the monitoring section works a little bit. And so as I turn it off, now I'm getting the record signal, but I'm not actually getting the signal being passed to the master. So that is a little bit about the monitoring and instruments and effects. Now, you might be asking, what if I have an external hardware synth like I do? So let's briefly chat about that. Under your instruments section, these are all the Ableton instruments. You have one called external instrument, and I'll drop that in. And just for you external instrument hardware synth users out there, this is what you would do. You would then select the MIDI to and the audio from. So if I was to pick MIDI 2 from, not my keyboards are not turned on right now, but if I picked, say, just my Motu Express box, and then now I can pick where that audio is coming from, and you can record the MIDI and then flatten that to audio with the freeze and flatten right here, and you have hardware latency options, you gain controls. It's perfect. I mean, it's just a great way to interface right into your hardware. So if you're wondering how to do that, that's how you can do it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about send and return. As you saw me send that strike to the reverb, I'm sending the whole thing. And a way to look at automation, we haven't talked about automation yet, which we will. You could just hit A and you can see your automation. Sorry, you need to make sure your computer keyboard is off for that to work. So if I hit A, I flip between automation. This is the automation mode right here, the button. And, I'm sending the whole thing. You see that line moving up and down.
And this is a test. I am recording.
But let's say I want to delay just the last word here of this voice. So if I select this delay, and now see my grid mode is in a weird spot. Okay, so I'm going to shrink up the grid, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip A on, and I can then select with the shift and just bring this up. And I don't need the whole thing.
Let's begin.
And you see my voice is being delayed by this amount. So let's go to quarter.
Let's begin.
Boom. And that's what I was talking about. When you're using automation, you could do all kinds of stuff. You can automate the volume. Maybe you want this to swell in. You can hold Option and make a curve, or you could take this and right click and draw in a shape. You can do a lot of cool things with automation. Now, the one thing you could do panning automation, and remember what I said, maybe you want to do the split pan mode so you can pan the left versus the right, and this will make it move across the left to right.
Be recording my audio, recording my voice, and playing with some of the.
Let me take this off, sorry.
Audio, recording my voice, and playing with
and you see it moving there. So automation is great because it allows you to automate things to your sends. It allows you to automate parameters like volume, panning. You can automate synth settings like cutoff. You can modulate things. You can use a modulation like an LFO and automate that. You can automate things like the rate or the speed or any parameter that you could really think of, you can automate. Now, this is getting into some more advanced stuff, so I don't want to get into it in the beginner's guide, but I want to let you know about the possibilities that exist. And I mentioned this before about automating the final phrase or word. This is how you would do it. You would have to send that. You really wouldn't be able to do that by putting this delay directly on this track. I mean, I guess you could use the device on and off and automate that, but that's not very handy when you could just send it to a send and return and then automate the send level. And then you also have volume or panning for the send and return. And one other thing that you need to understand about send and returns is if you're not familiar with analog mixers, you might not understand this concept, but I do talk about it in that send and return auxiliary send video I talked about earlier, is you have a button here called pre and post. And what this means is it's going to, the send level will be pre-fader. So let's go to the mixer view. These are your faders. And if I have a send that is pre-fader, that means that this send be pre or post. Pre means it's going to send it to this send, this return track, pre-fader, before this fader. Post means it's going to send it after this fader. So whatever the volume difference is, it's going to send it at that lowered volume. So I hope that makes sense, because if you want to send the full signal over to that delay, you need to switch it to pre-fader. And that's a very unique tactic because you might need to flip between the two depending on the type of send that you need. So it's a very detailed discussion about sends and returns. And then let's briefly chat about this mixer. I can adjust the volume. I can adjust things like panning. Remember, I can do split pan mode. And if I wanted to pan things over like this,
YouTube channel.
now you can see this is more to the right, this is more to the left, and this has automation. That's what that red means. I can delete the automation if I don't want it. This has automation, which was my delay send. And so, yes, we didn't make the most beautiful piece of music, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is to show you how to use Ableton. Okay, now I want to talk about the groove pool briefly. So the groove pool is a way for you to take these MIDI notes and swing them. And let's turn the automation off. If you're not familiar with the term swing, what it is it allows you to humanize the robotic MIDI notes that you're hearing, because what we made right now sounds very, very robotic. So if I were to double click on this and go into the groove, now I have a bunch of grooves here. And let's just go down to, see, you have logic, you have different swings, and if I click this, what's going to happen is it's going to drop it into the groove pool. If you want to look at what the swing is doing, just drag it into your timeline, and as you can see, I have a clip of this swing now, and then what you see is these notes are a little late, so this is off the grid, and what that's going to do is apply that type of swing. If I go in here and select that, it's going to apply that in real time. And the same here. If you want to visually see it, what you need to do is you need to commit them. So you can hit this little button here and commit that to. So you see, now I'm on none, but if I move to the 16ths and I hit this button, it moves these notes and it committed it to that groove of the 16th 57. So groove is a great way to kind of humanize your tracks, and let's turn all these to.
And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live.
And you can turn it into hot swap mode.
It's YouTube channel, and we're going to.
Let's do a extreme one.
My voice and playing with some of the warping capabilities.
And then you get things like the base quantization value, how much you want to quantize, the amount of straight quantization that is applied before the swing.
And this is a test.
You can control how much the groove patterns affecting the clips. You can randomize or change how much velocity of the notes are changing. So you can really play around with the feel and change the groove of your track. And it's very important that you play around with grooves, because if you're just making robotic music, it's not going to feel good and people are not going to like it. So you got to get good at trying to get your music sounding a little more humanized, and groove is a great way to do that. Okay, so what I did is I dragged in a break that I had, and let's go ahead and solo this. Shouldn't get hit with a copyright strike, it's just a drum break. But what I want to show you is how you can extract groove. So let's say you have a track you like that you're maybe using as a reference, or you just like the feel of it. You could bring it in your session. Make sure you get like a piece of the great loop that you like, and then right click on it. And what you can do is extract the groove. And what's going to happen is it's going to analyze this file, and it's going to create a groove clip for you to save in your groove pool. And as you see here, there is the groove, and it's named it. And then I can just drag that right into my groove pool if I wanted to save that. So there it is. And instead of, say, using the SP12, I could select, you know, if I wanted to put on my vocal, I could select that groove. And let's unmute that, mute this.
I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Master.
And I could save that if I wanted to go into my user library and go into grooves. I can literally drag that right into the groove pool and save that if I want. So I've saved some of my own grooves from other people, you know, but they're never going to know. So get creative and take some grooves of tracks you like and incorporate them into your own tracks. Also, if you make up some of your own kind of weird timing, you can extract grooves from your own clips and name them and store them. So the possibilities are endless with this. Okay, so we're nearing the end of the beginner's guide. This has been a great overview, but I want to talk about a few more things. One of the things I want to discuss is MIDI mapping. So as I explained before, this MIDI button here will adjust automation. And let's say I want to adjust the volume of this vocal as it's progressing. Well, I can record the automation or just draw it in. So if I select the MIDI note and pick the fader that I want, you see that it's adjusted this kick volume. So now that I've assigned this knob to this volume, I can actually record this in if I wanted to. So let me select automation on. Let me turn the automation on. Let's stop this real quick. Automation on, and you can see it moving. So let's record something.
And this is a test. I am recording the Ableton Live Beginner's Guide from Distinct Mastering YouTube channel. And we're going to...
And you can see that you can record the automation. Now, I have a cool trick in the utility video about recording volume automation. I don't actually do it on the track, so I'll make you go watch that video to learn that top tip. But there's a cool way to do it with the utility plugin, and it allows you to retain track volume. Another thing you can do, like I showed you before, is just draw in the automation. And if you hold Alt, you can draw curves and make things move in the weird ways. And so it's a great way to, you know, set up parameters so there's movement, things changing in your tracks. If you leave everything the same, the listener will get bored. So some common automation techniques would be to automate a filter, say a high pass filter, to where it sounds muffled and the high pass is coming up. Or you could automate volume changes, say with vocals or instruments where things are getting too loud. You could automate changes in volumes. Other things, you can automate panning. You can have things move from left to right. You could automate any synth parameter. So automation options can be endless. It's a little beyond the scope of a beginner Ableton video, so we won't be getting into that. But if you want to learn more about automation tactics and techniques, drop me a comment below and let me know what you're interested in learning about, and I can make some more future videos. All right, the next thing I want to discuss is how you can properly save your work and discuss different options for saving your work and how to export your music. So if you recall, let's turn off the automation. I pulled this in from another source. So if I lost that file, this break, I could permanently lose this if I needed it in my session. So a great feature is, and you're not going to be able to see this on my screen, I'm sorry, but if you go up to the file in the menu and hit collect all and save, and it's going to specify which media files are to be copied. I want to save files from everywhere, other projects, and hit OK. And now it's going to take all the external files, whatever, your kicks, your samples, your one-shots, your loops, everything, and put it into your session. So let's take a look at what that did, because I think this is very important for you to see. So let's go here and go to the Ableton guide. And now it made a samples folder. And this is where it imported the file that I brought in from an external source. And as you notice now, there's a lot more folders in here. We have the backup that we spoke about, and we have the vocal recordings. And so this project file gets bigger and bigger. And so it's important to understand how that works. And then the next thing that you're probably ready to do, even though this music is not very great, and most of the music that you make as a beginner is not going to be good. It takes a lot of practice to get good at this. And whatever we just made real quick was just whatever, but you know, you're probably going to want to listen to it at external sources. So you need to go up to File and you need to export audio video. And this is the export, the Ableton export screen. And I made a full detailed video on this back in the day as well. I'll leave you a link to that. But this is where you can export your audio. You get options like the selection that you want to export, or you can select it prior to that, like this. Just select and then go to the export window, and you'll see that the render length is now selected. You can render as a loop. You can convert it to mono, normalize it. You can create an analysis file. You get to choose the sample rate you want to export at, the type, the bit depth, any dither options if you need dither. And you don't typically need dither if you're leaving it in the same format that you started it in. And you can make an MP3 of it, and you can export video along with it. And once you hit export, it's going to ask you where you want this. And this is why I make that nice bounces folder, because this is my Ableton guide example, and I'm going to hit enter, and boom. Now my audio has been exported, and I can put it into SoundCloud, Dropbox, put it on my phone, listen to it anywhere I want. And so this is a basic overview of Ableton Live. I hope this helps you out. Thank you for watching this video on Ableton Live. If you have any questions, please shoot me a comment down below. And please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and the bell notification will keep you up to date. It really does help me out, so please do. And if you need help with your mastering, be sure to contact me with the free sample link down below. If you're a first-time potential client, I always offer one free stereo mastered sample. Thank you again for watching, and I hope this video helped you out.